Hello people watching this, my name is Josh, it's Jack editing this video, and thank you for checking out the video. Spider-Man, Peter Parker. Spider-Man has been one of the world's most popular superheroes since the 1960s, and he's never stopped being popular. And sure, he's had some downturns with unnecessarily complicated comic book arcs and dwindling popularity in the movies, but he's always been a powerhouse in the industry. His relatability and constant struggles have put him on top of the comic book map, and when he made it everywhere in live-action form was the Sam Raimi trilogy, it was a hit, and we wouldn't even have the MCU as we know it today without those movies. But for this video, we're talking about the current live-action cinematic adaptation of Spider-Man and its source of inspiration, and where the Raimi films almost entirely are inspired by the Stan Lee run and Webb's took a little bit from everything and added its own. It's a pretty safe assumption to say that the new MCU Spider-Man movies have taken their inspiration almost entirely from the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, except some references to the 616 universe, which is a typical Marvel comic book universe, here and there. But how accurately did they adapt the Ultimate comic? We have 10 reasons how he's been adapted accurately and how he hasn't been so accurately adapted. And none of these are in any particular order, but let's see what they are, shall we? Number 1, no Uncle Ben in sight. I chose this one to be first because for a lot of people it's one of the first things that come to mind when you think of how inaccurate the MCU Spider-Man can be. So why not just get it out of the way before it takes up too much time? Uncle Ben is obviously very important to Spider-Man. He's the voice in his head, his inspiration, he's part of his origin, he might be the person that Spider-Man misses the most. Yet there's only vague references toward Uncle Ben in the MCU. Another thing most people know, or at least have assumed and are most likely right about, is that he isn't mentioned because he's died in so many movies that it's a bit nuts. He died in the first Spider-Man movie with the Sam Raimi trilogy, the third one in the Sam Raimi trilogy where they retconned who his killer was, and even in the first Amazing Spider-Man movie where they redid Peter's origin. In such a short time span, it was deemed unnecessary and thought it was just probably better to cut to the chase and get to a Spider-Man with only very minor experience rather than absolutely no experience at all. However, no real mention of Uncle Ben from the characters, that's not very accurate. But you can make your own decision if it made Spider-Man's existence in the MCU better or not though for yourself. Number 2, the ages. While I have my freaking doubts that Peter Parker was originally intended to be 15 years old by Stan Lee just by looking at this clearly non-50-year-old Peter Parker drawn by Steve Ditko in Amazing Fantasy, so if you can prove me wrong on that one, by the way, by something actually said by like Stan or Steven, or just in that era comics in general, tell me, because I'd actually be very interested in. He just does not look 15 years old to me. But in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, Peter Parker is clearly a 15-year-old. Just look at that face, that's a 15-year-old boy. Spider-Man my ass, but it's Spider-Boy, blah blah blah. Let's get the terrible one-witty banner out of the way. And with the MCU as well, there's Spider-Man as a 15-year-old, much the same. While Tom Holland was actually 19 though during his first appearance as Spider-Man in Captain America Civil War, thanks to the use of Tom Holland's still useful face and a few camera tricks on him and his stunt doubles to make him look even shorter, as well as just his acting ability, he pulls off being 15 pretty well. And even with Aunt May, another criticism the MCU got was with the ever younger Aunt May, claiming that it was inaccurate thinking she should still be a decrepit old woman that dresses like she's still from the Victorian ages. But the MCU is actually accurate on this when compared to the Ultimate Comics, where Aunt May has more of an accurate age for someone's aunt. She just doesn't have gray hair that the comics have. The Ultimate Comics were made, or at least in Spider-Man's case, to modernize what was seen as out of date for him, taking Spider-Man away from the sweater vest bookworm of the 60s into more of an awkward, anxious, openly fanboyish geek. And Aunt May into more of a modern woman instead of looking like she's from a completely different century altogether. And she's entirely capable of taking herself in most situations. She's not a frail, living skeletal woman, yet she's always protective of her boy Petey. Number 3, the attitude. Spider-Man is more than just being someone who yells out quips, and Peter Parker is more than just a geek. Whenever someone debates who's the best person at playing the character in live action, it always feels like it comes down to that shallow understanding of who he is to judge who the best is, but that's a poor, at best, reasoning for it. The character, ever since the 60s, has an attitude. He may be shy, he may be awkward, anxious even, but the boy has an attitude. He doesn't have comebacks just as Spider-Man. This guy can get mad, frustrated, act out, and even insult first, Peter Parker or not, making Andrew Garfield, weirdly enough, the most accurate Spider-Man in that regard, even if he wasn't so accurate in other ways. In the MCU, the Spider-Man never really says anything back to Flash. When he's frustrated, he's more sad than bad comparatively. He's missing that internal drive and downright jerkwad energy that Peter Parker is capable of having, Which is why you'll see people saying that Civil War actually had the best Spider-Man adaptation rather than John Watts, where this side of Peter Parker is practically missing. And while I can't speak for Jack, as I am not Jack, hello guys, I am Josh, I think personally, as my own personal person, that his Civil War appearance is my personal favorite out of any of the movies. He just keeps the most Spidey in it out of all of them, if that makes any sense. Again though, with a character like Spidey, everyone is always free to have their own opinion. Number 4, yay, the mentors! Ultimate Spider-Man had both Nick Fury and Iron Man as mentors, much like Spider-Man in the MCU, in a different order than what happened in the comic, but most mentors nevertheless. Nick Fury in particular has a strong interest in the young hero in the comics. Contrary to popular belief, or at least sort of, both sides of the argument are so loud that I can't even tell you what the predominant vocal opinion is anymore. Tony Stark actually did see a lot in Spider-Man and became his mentor against what others have said about the comics, although that's just in the Ultimate Universe from what I've seen. Like, look at the Ultimate Spider-Man comics where Peter Parker looked up to and even admired Tony Stark for his technology and heroics, having Peter act more like how a teenager would in this situation. Versus the original Stan Lee comics where Iron Man was just known as Tony Stark's robotic bodyguard, and Peter just saw the Avengers as someone that would get in his way. Remember that attitude we talked about. There was no knowledge of Tony Stark being Iron Man yet, but we are comparing the MCU to the Ultimate Comics after all. Number 5, why the mentors? That doesn't mean it's entirely accurate though. Nick Fury was the more present mentor for Peter Parker, and while yes, Tony Stark was Peter's mentor and Peter was Tony's fanboy, as I said in the last entry, that wasn't for long. It happened very, very late in Peter's Ultimate Spider-Man run. In fact, it only happened in the story right before the series' very last story before Miles took over as Spider-Man. So while in the movies, Peter's whole quote-unquote professional superhero career is dictated by Tony picking Peter out of his lower middle-class apartment and having Peter communicate through Happy and check in on him every now and again, in the comics, that never got to happen because of Peter Parker. This is a big spoiler if you plan on reading the series, so please skip a few seconds away to avoid the big finale. And if Jack will, maybe you'll put a timer or put a little caption. Want to tell you when he can listen again. Peter got killed by the Green Goblin! Ow! And also Tony Stark is well talked to the Avengers about it first. Whereas in the movie he just does it as a reference to the comic Civil War where Peter Parker was on Iron Man's side. So this is a thing that's accurate and inaccurate about the MCU Spider-Man. Number 6, the Stark suit. Look at that suit! It's beautiful! It looks so based on the original Steve Ditko's suit, making arguably the most accurate adaptation of the suit ever. From the close resemblance of the logos, they're just a little bit more squared and modernized. The eyes and the colors, it's much accurate to that, and I love it so much. It's my personal favorite, but you can also love all of them, because personally, all the Spider-Man suits have something to love about him. He's one of the few characters that's never really had an inaccurate suit. Besides, arguably, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and Far From Home. But the Ultimate Spider-Man never had a Stark suit. And the Ultimate Comics has a darker color and have different eye shapes. But that doesn't mean the suit's bad, and it's not really what I mean when I say it's inaccurate. In the Ultimate Comics, there was no Stark suit. I don't even believe that there were different kinds of webs in that suit. Perhaps maybe 2, like when he swings and when he just shoots something out to catch the bad guys. And there was certainly no AI like Karen either. Peter in the typical Marvel Comics universe had the Iron Spider suit, but the Stark suit was no adaptation of that, and Ultimate Spider-Man had no such thing. Number 7, who are you people? Flash is a jock. The leads in these movies is just Miles' best friend Genki, and shouldn't Betty Brant be working for the Daily Bugle? What about her dark hair? We won't count the MCU's MJ, as it isn't even the same character, just the same nickname, and we aren't even talking about their race, as while it may not be accurate, it isn't much of a problem. It's just that some of these changes aren't very logical, let alone accurate. Some of these changes make sense as Flash in a genius school, so being a dumb jock wouldn't really make sense. But why bother using Ned Leeds' name if you're not going to use Ned Leeds? And then there's the fact that they had Brad from Far From Home, who's basically normal Flash, so they could have done that. I mean, I'd like the MCU Flash, but I'm just saying. And you know what? Sure, Peter had no friends in the original Stan Lee run during his high school days, and he already did Harry Osborn twice, but we're comparing this to the Ultimate Universe. No Mary Jane, no Gwen Stacy. They might have been done before, but they're predominant Spider-Man characters nonetheless. People probably would have liked to have at least seen a Harry that didn't get turned to Spider-Man's enemy right away too. You know what? Like, make MCU MJ Gwen Stacy, as she somewhat matches the kind of edgy kid Peter has a crush on, and just after a few tweaks, you can even make Ned's role Mary Jane's. Maybe even keep Ned too. Besides, you'd still get comments on just being ganky though, so maybe not. Who knows? So while Peter might be in school, which is accurate to the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, people occupying it look to be strangers compared to the Ultimate Universe. There's not even a Kong. That's so undignified. Number 8, a more youthful Peter. We already discussed Peter Parker's age being accurate, but even in personality, Peter Parker is obviously one that's a lot younger. He's more immature and even reckless, which is something he has in common with the Ultimate Spider-Man, who also is the same way, besides the attitudes thing we talked about earlier. You can both tell these Spider-Mans are just kids just by the way they act and they socialize and their own youthful stubbornness and bad ideas that they choose to act on. They're all about responsibility for both of them, but that doesn't mean either are perfect about it. Sometimes they think the wrong thing is the more responsible thing, or even just their own emotions get the better of them. MCU Peter isn't heard saying or hearing, "With great power comes great responsibility," because with constant repetition comes redundancy after a while. But he clearly, in a roundabout way, does have that message, and he does say it to Stark on their first meeting, just not with the same words. It's just that when you're younger, no matter how hard you try, you don't always make the right choices. Number 9. No comparison to Iron Man in the Ultimate Universe. Ending on the biggest complaint or criticisms, as in this is going to be the last of the complaints and criticisms, on the main list, whichever you choose to call it, of the MCU Spider-Man is just how often he's compared to Iron Man. And while the message at the end of the day for the both of his solo movies is that, no, you're not Tony Stark, you are Spider-Man, it doesn't really stop. And it's a general conflict that Peter deals with all the time. In the comics, Peter's villains hate Peter because he is Peter. No connection to Stark. Spider-Man is just this loud, chatty kid that keeps making them look dumb and they hate him for it. Every villain Peter's gone up against besides Thanos has been because of Tony in the MCU, and even his own connection to Tony Stark. Spider-Man's villains turn to Iron Man villains that Peter has to take care of because they're below Stark's pay grade, which is a very strange thing to do when it's a Spider-Man movie, which along with the suit's AI and mentorship to Stark, gets this Spider-Man labeled by some detractors as Iron Boy Jr. Not a pleasant name for one of the biggest names in superhero history, when they're inside the comics they're out on cinema screens. It's certainly not something Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's famous creation deserves. Number 10. Good old number 10. Aunt May knows. Aunt May knows who Peter Parker is eventually in the MCU, the Ultimate Universe, and even the standard comics universe, though that one did not last long. Hello. One more day. And with the two we're comparing today, and also because I didn't read the story from the standard universe, they both freak out. Albeit MCU Aunt May does it mostly off screen, and then they come around to it eventually for the both of them. Heck, Ultimate Aunt May at one point basically unofficially adopts Johnny Storm and Bobby Drake too. They both still worry and hope for the best, but both Aunt Mays at least allow him to help because they realize how much good he puts out into the world, and isn't that wholesome? Aww.
Bonus number 11. Similarities to Miles. Oh shit, I'm doing this one. Oh hi. Because with the MCU Spider-Man is Peter Parker, they did take aspects from Miles to give to Peter before Miles even got his own movie, which is to say the least. Some of these are going to Genius Kid School, Genki/Ned, and living up to another hero's legacy. Stuff that Peter Parker didn't quite have, but Miles did. Both are Ultimate Spider-Man, but given that the MCU Spider-Man is Peter, this is a bit more to the inaccurate side.
Welcome to the epilogue. Do you think that the positives outweigh the bad, or do you think the negatives are far too much for you? Which Spider-Man films are your favorites? Out of the Raimi trilogy, the Webb trilogy, and the Watts trilogy? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe as long as it's hitting that notification bell. This has been Josh, if you didn't hear me say it the first 2 times, and this is Sleek Geeks if you haven't seen what the channel you're watching is, and we hope that you enjoyed your stay, and that you enjoy the rest of your day.